So, and I'm curious, are there certain dogs that learn better than others?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
There's no doubt
Is
there.
it equivalent to people that have ADHD or something or what?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
So there's a variety of factors that govern that. So one could be that one dog is very distracted and has a hard time concentrating. Some dogs are just quicker learners than others, just like humans. Like there were subjects in school that I was good at and I picked up on quickly, and there were other subjects in school that I wasn't so good at, and I
Right.
had to work harder to connect those. And then the other big ticket item here is motivation, right? How motivated is the dog for rewards, the traditional rewards that we use in dog training?
Mm,
Food, toys, physical affection, those kinds of things that we're using to reinforce behavior or reward behavior. The more motivated the dog is for those, typically the easier they are to train. The
right.
less motivated they are for those things, and the more difficult they are to train, right? Which is
Got it.
obviously, right? So if the dog doesn't want something from me, it's very difficult for me to go like, hey, come on, this is fun, right? And a big part of our early training with the dog is to try to make them enjoy training, right? This whole process of interacting with me is fun. So the more motivated they are for the rewards, the better that tends to go.
Right. What could you tell us about what animals or what these dogs think? I mean, it's so hard to get into their minds, and you read all these articles about, if they do a certain behavior, it must mean this. I mean, you've been working with with dogs for so long. What would you say is misunderstood about what they think, and what should we know?
I think one of the biggest things is that we treat dogs like they're little people, right?
Mm,
So people assume understanding from a dog when they don't understand necessarily what you're talking about. Like the average person speaks to their dog in full sentences. They're inconsistent about how they follow through on things. And so imagine you were in a country where everyone was speaking a completely different language, right? And you were trying to figure out what these words meant.
mm,
And people were talking at you, and they weren't saying something like saying a specific word and pointing at a table for you to understand. They were speaking in full sentences, and you had to pick out which word in that sentence meant table, right? And
right.
then they weren't consistent about saying table and pointing at the table. Sometimes they did, and sometimes they didn't, right? And this is what the average person does with their dog. So the dog looks at you trying to figure out, and pretty soon goes, I can't make hide or hair what you're talking about.
Right.
Because there's this idea that dogs understand what's coming out of our mouth. We have to work kind of hard at that. Like dogs aren't verbal creatures, for instance, right? They don't talk to each other. And we talk around them all the time. And
Mm,
99.9% of what comes out of my mouth has nothing to do with them. So they
mm,
learn if unless what comes out of my mouth predicts something very consistently for them, they start to tune that out. They just move it to the ignore file.
right.
And I think that's one of the biggest things that people are assuming understanding in their dog when their dog has no idea what they're talking about.
Right. So, but do you think they really understand what you mean when they've learned the sit command or the stay command? Do you think it registers in their head that they're supposed to sit, or it's like the Pavlov thing where they just know to move their body down and they're going to get a treat? I mean, do they
So
understand like that?
a well-trained dog understands, but they go through a whole series of levels of understanding along the path when you're teaching them, right? So if you ask most people if their dog knows how to sit, they say, "Oh, sure, my dog knows what sit is," but their dog frequently knows sit in a very specific context. Maybe they
Mm,
know sit in my living room or my backyard when I have food in my hands and the dog's in front of me, right? That's one picture. But
mm,
that doesn't mean the dog knows how to sit when they're next to me or at a distance from me, or if my back's turned to them, or when I don't have food in my hands. All those things are part of the picture. And what we call this process of learning to understand something like a command or a concept in a variety of different situations, it's called
mm,
generalization, right? And dogs look at an entire picture. They're like situational learners, right? And so there's a really fascinating woman, you may be familiar with her. Her name's Temple Grandin,
mhm.
and Temple is autistic, and she's written books on livestock science and autism. And
Yeah,
she
very
realized
cool.
when she was in college that as someone that was on the spectrum, she saw the world sort of the way animals did. And she has a great book called Animals in Translation, right, which is a really interesting book. And what she says is that that's on a certain level on the spectrum, they see entire pictures. They think in pictures. And that's kind of what dogs do, right? So if my dog learned sit while it was in front of me and my hands were in front of my body and it was looking at me and I made this sound sit, they know it in that context, but it doesn't mean they know it in other contexts.
Got
And
it.
most of the work of dog training is transferring that to a bunch of different contexts until finally the dog says, aha, I get it. That sound means put my butt on the ground, regardless of all these other things that are happening, right?
Right.
And that takes time. That's when I talked earlier about there aren't kind of quick fixes and shortcuts to this. Your dog may understand a cue in a specific situation, but that doesn't mean they understand it everywhere.
Right. Right. How much do dogs pick up on human emotion?
Oh, immensely.
More
Like,
so than a word.
oh, absolutely. Right.
Okay.
In order for them to
Expand on
attend to a word from me, I have to work really hard.
that.
But they're very attentive to our emotional moods, right? They watch us, they observe us, they are social creatures. And no other creature in the world works as hard as dogs do to figure us out. It's
Hmm.
kind of heartwarming. If you could work with any other kind of animal, they can be smart, they can learn, etc. But dogs are unique in their ability to want to sort of fit into our social structure and to figure us out, even when we're being inconsistent. So they're very sensitive to our emotional states. If you raise your voice, or if you're in a good mood, a bad mood, frustrated, the dogs feel those energetics really quickly, and that will strongly influence your relationship and the training process as well. Yeah.
Huh. Can they be trained to help with their owner's emotional state?
Oh, sure, absolutely. So, service a lot of the emotional support service dogs, dogs for veterans and people with PTSD, all in that
Yeah.
service dog community. A lot of those dogs are highly tuned in to signs of oncoming emotional signs of seizures or nervous breakdowns or anxiety attacks. And the dogs can be a step ahead of that. If a well-trained dog can be a step ahead of that, and they can actually warn somebody ahead of time or even
Right.
learn to do certain soothing behaviors that help kind of a person work through an anxiety attack, for instance, right?
Yeah, I've seen that, examples of that. You've got to explain that to me. How are these dogs trained to do that? And when sometimes we can't even see those cues.
Yeah, so it's a specific kind of dog. So what they do is they take a lot of different dogs
Hmm.
and they put them in, they teach them to pay attention to their handler, right? So the first step is just reinforcing them for paying close attention to their handler. And
Hmm.
those dogs are strongly bonded and they learn to look at their owners and pay close attention. And then we hope and then they teach them some kind of behavior that they're going to do
Hmm.
when prompted. Let's say they're going to teach the dog to come up and paw you. And so they teach that behavior separately and they
Hmm.
put a cue to that behavior. And now the dog watches you. And when you're getting anxious or whatever, a trainer would then cue the dog to paw at you. And you hope that through repetition, this could be true of kind of seizure activity, all kinds of
Yeah.
stuff. And then the dog learns if the dog's attentive, a certain type of dog will pick up on the precursor signals. If they watch you often enough and they're with you often enough, they'll pick up on that. And then they start to offer that behavior when they see you entering that emotional state. And they
Right.
may notice it before you do, right? In those circumstances. Not every dog can do it. So
Is it a
there are
certain breed or it's just a certain attentive
specific
dog?
individual dog. Yeah. And so if you talk to service dog trainers and organizations that are trying to breed and train dogs for this, they have about a 70% washout rate. So meaning
Really?
like only about 30% of the dogs that enter their programs are actually capable of doing that stuff, right? And the dogs, and that part of that is just one dog just doesn't notice, one dog doesn't pay close enough attention, and another dog doesn't care the same way. So it's a kind of a specific suite of treats that make that happen. Traits.
Could